Anyone can make a survey. Seriously. What you do is you put together some questions and you send them to someone. See, this is the shortest video we have so far. Anyone can do it. In fact, I've seen just about anyone do it. I've had bosses who said, oh, we've already surveyed this. And I said, okay, so what does that look like? And they showed me their survey, that is their survey instrument, and that's what they'd done. They'd ask questions. And, there are conditions under which that's useful. I do that too. I ask my family whether they're coming for Christmas. That's a survey, I guess. But in the particular case of trying to get valid data, it's not enough. And so surveys can be deceptively simple to construct and really, really difficult to develop in a way that is valid, that gets you results that are useful. And I can't tell you how to do that. I can't tell you how to do that in the next few minutes. I probably couldn't tell you how to do that really well in a course, in part because it's not one of my favorite methods, but also because there's more than a course's worth of data here. I have folks I know that have worked at places like Pew and at places like Quinnipiac, which used to be where I taught. Both of them have large survey operations, and there are people who dedicate their lives to thinking about how to make those surveys more effective and better, and thinking about things like how to make sure you're sampling properly, and whether random digit dialing still makes sense for political surveys, and a whole range of questions that we aren't going to address here. In part because although surveys are by far one of the most widely used methods in the social sciences, they are less used by folks who do the kinds of things that we do in our program, and because I don't like them. That's the real reason. I think part of the reason I don't like them is that I've seen so many of them do so much that just isn't useful. So at the very least, at the end of this, I'd like you to be able to, if you decide you need to do a survey to find out something about a population that is accessible through survey methodology, then you will at least have a hint of the kinds of steps you need to go through to get there, right? The first of these is, and this is going to be a broken record, you have to clarify what your research question is. Now, this is not clarifying what the questions on your instrument are. This is clarifying your research question. And I think of those kinds of naive surveys I've told you about before, there is the assumption that the research question is the question you're asking people. And sometimes there is some of that. Sometimes it's fairly close to a one-to-one correspondence. But in most cases, you have to think about what you're trying to extract from this survey, what bigger question you're trying to answer, and then the kinds of prompts, the kinds of survey questions and items that you will use to kind of populate that. Some of this is about figuring out how to how to align those questions with a set of measures, and those measures with a set of questions. So you've actually got a couple of layers here in place. Along with just kind of the naive, I have a research question, let me ask a bunch of people, is this idea that you are restricted by the medium in which you are presenting it. And there are definitely formal constraints on what you can do. So I know someone just recently who did a survey about whether people could determine whether something is produced by AI, for example, for whether it has been produced by an AI image generator, right? And when they did this, you have to go through the technical hurdles of what can you show them? Can you show them video? Can you show them an image? How are they going to get this? Are they going to be looking at it on a phone? Are you going to do it on paper and then scan the results in? So some of those strictures can limit you somewhat. So part of the problem here is that you might just end up copying what you've seen before, and this happens an awful lot. You see this in a couple of ways, especially. One is you see a bunch of people doing Likert scales, the very much to not at all, with with 5 or 7 options in between. And why are you using that? Because that's what you've seen used, and so you assume that it's the right thing to use. It might be. I generally don't think it is. I'll talk about that in a second. Also, all the demographic info. You're asking about all the demographic info, and often that is asked, and often there's a good reason for it. There may be a difference that makes a difference between men and women, or a difference that is between genders, or ethnicity, or income. But these basic demographics are often a Hail Mary. They're like, oh, well, I need to have another chart, so I better tease out these. If you don't have a theoretical basis for asking for that demographic information, it's just kind of, you're doing it because you've seen it before. So try to avoid that. Try to be purposeful in the instrument that you're building. So kind of before you're starting to design this survey instrument and survey process, you should be thinking about what's the phenomenon you're studying. What is it you're trying to get at? Why does it matter theoretically or socially? What are your units of analysis? What is it that you're going to be analyzing, and how are you drawing borders and defining those things? And what population are you trying to describe, or do you think can inform your question? I don't think we've talked about this before. This gets us into the, chances are you've kind of run into it in other courses, but just in case you haven't, you generally talk about a universe, a population that you're trying to study, and then you sample from that population. So if you're trying to get a representative sample, you need to know something about the characteristics of the population you're trying to get at, and then you'll get a sample that represents that larger population. So you're generally not going to be surveying an entire population. That does happen, though. We talked about this before, that I think, especially as we get to big data, the inferential piece of it is less important. But traditionally, I can't actually ask everybody in America who they plan to vote for in the next election. So I will try to get a representative sample of 1,200 people or 600 people who can answer that question for me. And through the magic of statistics, I can guess at how close that matches what the population thinks, or how far off it might be. Once you have this clarity, you're getting to the point where you can start to think about how you would operationalize some of those questions. It's a little surprising we haven't talked about this yet, but I guess we've touched on it, but maybe not explicitly. One of the things you need to do is make the move from these broad, maybe vague, maybe abstract concepts into something that is a set of measurable variables. Ideally measurable variables that are related in some way, or that you're guessing might be related in some way. A variable is simply something that varies. It can be more or less. It's usually a quantitative measure, although there are ways to think about this in categories. We'll talk about in a second, or even in more qualitative descriptive forms. But generally speaking, a variable is just something that might vary depending on how someone answers it. Many of the things that we think about in the social sciences, things like trust, things like literacy, forms of identity, feelings of well-being, you can't directly observe these. Surveys rely on some kind of indicator that serves as a proxy for these broader concepts. So you can't just kind of say, and we talked about this, I think, in the sense of friend, like how do you have some friends? I don't have any friends. I'm not social, but do you have some friends? How do you know they're your friends? Do you have a friend test? Maybe not, but like if I said, how many friends do you have? What would you answer? I mean, take a second. Seriously, how many friends do you have? Okay, so that's great. I can ask you that, but when I ask you that, what you think a friend is and what I think a friend is are two different things. Like, would you kill someone for this person? Is that a friend, or is that too high a bar? Would you include them in a party? Is that a friend, or is that too high a bar? I mean, is that just someone you know, right? Is that just an associate, right? So like we have different internal views, and we probably haven't thought, my guess is you haven't thought about what's my friend test. How do I know which of my friends are my real friends? If you have, that may be another issue, but you probably haven't thought about that. So that operationalization may have no direct relationship to real life. But we need to have some measurable quantity if we're trying to get measurements. This is moving from the concept to measurement. And honestly, sometimes this feels somewhat artificial, right? Is it would you lend this person $50? Is that what it is? Is it how do you take what is a fairly abstract concept and then translate it? Literacy might be a little easier, right? Can you read this and do you understand what it means? Well, what's the this, and how do you know that understanding is valid? So like all of these are pretty, that's the hard step. That's the step that the people who are doing naive surveys don't do, right? It's taking a concept and saying, how do we measure this in a set of items or a set of variables that can be operationalized, again, in a way that everyone else, very explicit, everyone else can understand and replicate, right? This always involves some level of trade-offs. You always have to throw something out with it. You're simplifying it in some sense. It has to be if you're going to measure it. This is that trade-off we've talked about all along. This is why we use multiple methods, so that when we throw something out with the bathwater for doing a survey, we could try to bring it back by adding texture in some other way, by using a combination of methods. The survey gets us to reliability, that is, it can be reused and get the same answers, and some level of validity, that is, it seems to be measuring the concept you're getting at, and does it in such a way where you can kind of approach a very large collection and get that information. But you throw out some of the texture, some of the nuance. You're going to throw things out anytime you're moving from this broad concept to a very narrowly defined measurable quantity, right? So you have to think about what are the most relevant elements of this concept that you're trying to get at. You should definitely be looking to see whether there are existing validated measures. You can go through, I'm sure, I should have checked this before I recorded this, but I'm sure ASU, like most university libraries, probably has a guide that points you towards search engines that will get you towards these. These are replete in fields like psychology, right? Where we have decades of validated tests for, everything from IQ to sorts of measures of different kinds of emotional states so these are items that you can ask people about that have been validated across large groups of respondents. And by validated, I mean that they have tested against them and used them both in terms of it being a repeatable measure, reliable, but also tested against a number of items and having them kind of support one another. We don't need to get into the details of that. If you want to, there's lots of places you can dive to do that. But by using an existing test or an existing measure, you're able to both you're able to rely on it being something that has already been validated by other researchers. But it also means that when you use that, other people can look at your research and look at the measure you've used, and it can be interoperable in some sense, right? The people know that when you have these measures of these particular values, that you've seen it used in other studies, and you can actually then use that as a way to connect those studies when you do meta-analysis in some cases. At the very least, it's reliable. That is, you've seen it used elsewhere. But beyond that, it could be interoperable. You could be able to draw other data in and make some comparisons and start to think about how very different concepts studied by two different people might connect because they have this single measure in common, if that makes sense. And you need to think about the kind of the level of measure that you need for your analysis. Are you talking about, this has to do with your units, but are you talking about dyadic relationships, like I said before, like friendships? Are you talking about internal states, how a person is, right? What is it that you're measuring for what kind of unit when you do this? As I said, there's formal constraints here. They're not just the kind of what's available. Like there's things like what's available in the software, what's available, how much time can you draw from these people? Are you putting them on a phone? Do you have language constraints? Do you have to do this into multiple languages? All these are things you need to think about as you're moving into this. Okay, so now that you've gotten through those steps and you've thought about what concepts you're trying to measure and you've operationalized them in some sense, now you finally get to the most visible part of the research instrument, that is the actual items or questions on your survey. But these are also the most easily misunderstood steps. So effective questions are clear, unambiguous, focused on a single idea, and free from leading or evaluative language. If some of this sounds familiar, it's because this is an instantiation of a formal interview, right? These are the same kinds of things we want to make sure we're doing for interview questions, but we need to make sure that we're doing it also for this structured survey instrument. You need to be careful of double-barreled questions. This is the sort of thing where you ask this and this, are you this or this? You need to try to keep it concise, straightforward, so that you know you're only measuring one concept. This sounds like it's obvious, but it can actually be more challenging than you would expect. You need to make sure that you are as free as possible from implicit assumptions about the thing you're measuring, and that you need to make sure that that when you have terms that mean things to different people, that you are using that you are being explicit about your use of that term. So you need to be very clear about the language that you're using. That's really hard to do. We'll talk about it in a second, why it's important to pilot these, because we have certain built-in assumptions about our own use of language that are hard to overcome in many cases. Online surveys in particular, you need to be careful about. And this is something that's evolved over time as well, but respondents are often going through it quickly. They're often going through it on their phone while they're waiting for the dentist to come back or whatever. And this makes the importance of plain language in big type, brevity, some kind of visual clarity is really important. And the ability to, like, especially given differences in ages, and that I'm in the top end, not the top. I'm getting to the top, hopefully, of the ages of people that will respond to these. My eyes are going. I need big type. I also need not little tiny little bubbles that I have to push because I have big clumsy fingers and a small tiny phone. So these kinds of things you need to think about this as you're kind of that's more of an interface question than actually forming the questions themselves. But it is easier for me to read it if it's a short, explicit, clear question. You have to expect that people don't necessarily have the same vocabulary you do. You should be kind of grinding this down to the lowest common denominator in terms of education of your respondent, within your population. This gets especially hard if you're asking surveys of younger people or something like that. But it's true across the board. You should always, without treating your respondent groups as if they're stupid, you should always assume that you should use the most restrictive vocabulary you can and the simplest sentence construction that you can whenever possible. That sentence was way too complicated already. When you're thinking about response formats, think about cognitive load. I'll do a back and forth here because I actually like, I may bring this up, I like a particular kind of way of answering a question that increases the cognitive load. There is a playoff here, right? Overall, you want to reduce the cognitive load. You want to be able to have people answer rapidly without having to think through it. You shouldn't have to sort of interpret the question. But there are times when I'd rather they thought about it than just answered quickly. So there is a give and take here. But generally speaking, okay, I will kind of touch on this briefly, in part because I work with some colleagues who were very big on a set of ways of doing measurement. I really like what are called ratio scales, and as a result, I really like sliders. Sliders are difficult because you have to interpret, because often they're not as familiar to people, at least immediately when they hit it, so it does require a little bit more cognitive load. It also can be difficult to interpret, right? Because people will bring their own biases into where the slider should be. People feel really uncomfortable in most cases of turning something all the way up to one extreme or the other. But what it means is if you have, especially if you have items that compare against each other, you get to do sort of ratios of comparison. And this really does get you a lot more depth to your answers. Whether that's a valid depth, I don't know entirely. Again, I don't trust surveys, but it does give you more to work with in terms of data and maybe some more interesting comparative data. So if you can look at a set of ways people have used sliders and you have things that might compare against each other, you could do something like force, if you give someone a list of 20 famous musical artists, and you have them use sliders to indicate how much they like or dislike, terrible measure, but like how much they like or dislike each of these, how likely they would be to put it on if they had guests over for a party, at the end, instead of just having a list of likes or dislikes or really likes and somewhat likes and kind of are okay with, you can actually force rank these at this point afterwards, right? You can say, oh, well, okay, they didn't rank any of these exactly equally, so I can kind of get an idea of where these would be in a force rank. Or I can see that we have a cluster of those that are really well liked. I can kind of figure out for an individual respondent where each of these might cluster. I could even use that later on to kind of think about what my scale should look like. So I'm a big fan of sliders. This is my short advertisement for sliders. Now we'll move on. So let's talk. This does feed into, this is a segue, I suppose, about questions of validity, reliability, and issues of bias when you're designing these survey items. So the ongoing reminder, validity is whether you're measuring what you think you're measuring. Reliability is whether we do so consistently. And there are a number of forms of validity that are relevant to survey design. There's something called face validity or content validity, whether the questions appear appropriate and whether they're sufficient to measure the totality of the thing that you're trying to measure. Construct validity talks about whether the survey actually captures your larger construct, your larger concept that you're trying to operationalize. Okay, and there are a number of other kinds of ways of thinking about validity, but broadly speaking, you're trying to make sure that the items that you've designed kind of wrap up into a concept that then wraps up into the thing that you're trying to measure, the idea that you're trying to measure. Often you have multiple items. I should mention this, you've probably run into this. If you've ever taken sort of the Minnesota Multiphasic or one of these, you'll find that there are often lots of items that may be scattered throughout the instrument, or throughout the survey, that then get kind of combined into an overall measure, right? So it's not necessarily one question goes to one concept, goes to one variable, goes to one major idea and how it relates. Often you'll have multiple items that might go towards this, and part of the reason for that is that it does add to validity if those tend to stack. Doing this in an online environment, it adds issues, adds potential issues. Respondents can interpret questions differently depending on what device they might be on, what context they're in, what their cultural background is, where they encounter it, how you've approached them. All of these tend to mess with issues of validity, and so it's hard to get to kind of a measurement equivalence across all of these items. Bias continues to be an issue as well. Online surveys can reduce some of the social desirability bias that we talked about for interviewing. You can't see the person in front of you usually for surveys unless it's like a structured interview. And so people might be a little bit more, let's say, I guess, honest, a little less interested in impressing the survey instrument. But there's other pieces here. You have serious issues around satisficing. So the satisficing refers to, satisficing is this portmanteau from 1971, I think, between satisfying and sufficing. And it turns out that we often do this. If you put a rat in a cage and there's food in various places, and you give them a puzzle to solve to get to the food, they might go for the easy puzzle to get a little less food because that's enough, right? And directly related to that kind of rat in a cage issue is satisficing for example, search engine results. 80% of people never go beyond the first page of search engine results. Only something like 1% have ever gotten more than 10 deep in any search ever. So we have those kinds of results as well. This is why things like search order on Amazon are so important, because people are willing to forego getting the very best response for getting instead the quick response. And so this is an issue for any kind of a survey where people are trying to get through it very quickly. If they're getting paid to do the survey, if you've ever done a longer survey, you've probably hit some of the trap questions where they ask if you're a human, in the most extreme example. But sometimes they're just questions where there's only really one right response, and they're just checking to make sure. And sometimes it'll say on this response, put down 5, right? It is kind of a CAPTCHA version of it, but sometimes it's a little more subtle than that to make sure that you're not just kind of going all the way through. For some online survey instruments, one of the ways you can check this is to see how long they've taken to do it. So you can see how long was spent on each item or on each page to see if people are just kind of ripping through it. But you have to think through, there's this process, you can do some internal checks. There's something called straight lining where people will just do the same, go through a list of items and just hit the same thing all the way through. That's something you can detect. Speeding through the questions very quickly can be detected. All of inattentive responses. So the thing comes up and then the person doesn't actually respond, or you can measure to see whether someone has left the page or left the item and come back to it. So there's ways you can measure this, but those are really just mitigating what's an ongoing issue, which is once you've given someone something, you don't know the context in which they're actually filling it out. And even interface design, little subtle things can affect this. There's ways to test this using A/B testing, but little small changes, what's your background color? This can actually have an effect on how people fill out a survey. So there's all kinds of stuff that can sneak in and bias this, and you have to A, think about it ahead of time, and B, test it to make sure that's not a problem. By far, I think I've just said it's hard to construct a survey because of the operationalization and coming up with good items, and I think that's true. As a practical matter, the hardest part for me has always been a question of sampling, of recruitment, and of getting some kind of representative recruitment. Actually, honestly, part of that is for those surveys where I've paid people, it's dealing with getting a university to take money that I've gotten in funding and get it out to them in a gift card, because you can't actually give them cash because we're at State University. So you have to give them a gift card from Starbucks or from Amazon, but then there's anyway, you don't need to know all this. There's a whole audit trail because you're getting a whole bunch of gift cards and they want to make sure you're not giving them to your friends and that sort of thing. So leaving that aside, the hardest part from a research perspective is often figuring out, what is your universe what is your population that you're trying to sample? Then sampling that population, how is it that you can select out, if you're doing it as a random sample, how can you select out, a sample that is representative? And then, and that's not the only way. We aren't going to talk about sampling theory here, but there are ways, for example, if you're doing, I talked earlier about random digit dialing for doing sampling for example, political elections, for election polling. And often what you want to do is make sure that you have not just a random sample in that case, but something that's representative. That is, do you have some group, what the population looks like in terms of broad characteristics, some of those demographic characteristics, for example. Then you can, one of the reasons you might ask demographic questions, this is often why you actually see it in survey instruments, is because you can make sure that your demographics in your sample line up with the demographics of your population. So there are other ways of making sure that it is in some way representative, but generally speaking, getting some kind of random sample is where you want to go, especially if you're using this survey, and surveys usually are used this way, as being representative of a larger population, so you can infer from your sample results to the larger population. Especially in student work, I always see them saying they're using a convenience sample. A convenience sample just means what it sounds like. It means that you basically surveyed the people that would take the survey. I don't know, it's one of those things like, it's one of a number of key phrases that you often see in written work where I think people have just seen it and so they think that this is kind of a get out of jail free card. Oh, it's a convenience sample. Okay, well that's great. But what that means is it's not really a sample, right? If it's not very clearly representative of a population in some way, that's not sampling. That's just asking people questions. That's okay. But if you're saying that, you need to be aware of the very serious constraints that puts on the validity of the collection that you're doing. So how do you actually recruit people to do your survey? Again, I'm coming at this from someone who's highly critical of surveys. So one of the things I want to say kind of off the bat, my gut reaction is you don't. It's just really hard to get people to take a survey. Especially now, I think there's been such an extreme sort of, people have been surveyed to death. And so they, unless it's something that's really interesting to them, unless they feel invested in it in some way, it's really unlikely that they'll want to take the survey. I mean, one of the places that you get a lot of survey work done where there is pretty serious methodological oomph behind it and often funding behind it is in the medical field. And there, you really need to have high response rates in order to demonstrate that you have a representative sample. So this is part of the problem, part of the bias problem, right? Which is who's going to, I'll put this in the terms of random digit dialing. For a long time, political polls where you take the phone book and or you just dial a random digit. Either way, I mean, the term makes it sound like you're dialing a random digit. Usually what you have is a bank of the equivalent of the white pages for anyone who's old enough to remember what white pages are. and you're randomly selecting home numbers from that. Home numbers is not a thing that really exists anymore. People do have landlines, but it is a rapidly shrinking population. And usually what you're calling is landlines. So the people that pick up, the people that you're reaching for your sample are people that have a landline, people that will pick up that landline and not when they don't recognize the number, or pick up the cell phone when they don't recognize the number, and then not hang up on you immediately when you start speaking. And that's a very select group of very lonely people. I did in my darkest days of undergraduate, I did telephone sales. Now, it's not the worst kind of telephone sales. I wasn't trying to sell people car warranties or anything like that. I was calling people to interest them in a seminar by a couple of engineering professors who did seminars on sort of power engineering. And that was horrible. I mean, I hate the phone anyway, but cold calling people to ask if they wanted to learn more about power engineering was rough. Now, this wasn't random digit dialing. That would be even worse. These were people who had engineering degrees, right? So they had bought this list from somebody. One of the ways you can get at the sample is to buy a list from, say, a professional organization or something like that. And that's what they'd done. They bought a list from a professional organization, and I was reaching out. And like, I would call somebody. I called somebody at one point, and they picked up, and they were really seemed like they were interested in this. And for me, I wasn't actually doing a hard sell. It was mostly just kind of doing an intro, getting their information, saying I'd send them out information. But this guy wanted to talk. And it was because he was working at a nuclear power station somewhere in California, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. I should know offhand, but it was somewhere out towards the Arizona border. And the way this worked is they basically sent him out there to sit at this power station for 2 weeks out of every month and a half. And so he had talked to no one in 2 weeks. And I random dial digited him and said, hey, would you like to talk about power engineering? And oh yeah, he wanted to talk about power engineering. And I kept saying, no, that's great. We'll be happy to send you something. And just, it was anyway. So the people who when you do this, the people who will answer the survey first are the ones that are not necessarily representative. And so especially for medical surveys, where you need to hit a certain level of completion, they will be dogged in getting those last few surveys in. Nobody's going to get to 100%, but if you're at 40%, you really want to move that up to 44 or 48 or over 50% completion. And so you'll be sending people emails saying, hey, we really need your survey back. And so that can be really tricky. Because it's kind of hard to get at the survey groups, and you can buy the lists, but they're not necessarily people who will respond. It's more and more common to make use of a set of pre-selected respondent panels. So there are a number of companies that have, and some of them are things like Qualtrics, which is one that we often use for surveys out of our unit, and in academia in particular. SurveyMonkey has these as well, and then there are a dozen others that have kind of specialized panels of a particular population, or generalized American ones where they've stratified the sample and made sure they kind of are in some way representative of everybody in the US, or so you can find them according to a certain set of criteria. And you can ask them, generally they're pretty good about this, about how did you recruit these people? How have you validated that they are representative in some sense? And this is nice because you have kind of an instant group of people who are going to answer your question because they're getting paid to answer it, and because they're going to get paid to answer more down the road. You have already some information about them. In many cases, you can get access to their demographics without asking them because they've already answered that. You can often get other kind of instruments that they've completed as well. So they may have completed for somebody else, but that person has said, yes, you can share this information about this population with other researchers. And as a result, you might know like what magazines they like to look at. You might have a lot of data about these poor overstudied people that you can then use that you don't actually have to ask them. So that's nice. They're fast. You can kind of, you go from zero to having a panel to being able to put out your completed survey very quickly. They often are already ready on the platform and set up. And for some research questions, they're just the most practical option available. They're just something that kind of works, right? There's some significant downsides to this. The most obvious one of this that is not a methodological problem so much as a cash problem is that these can be very expensive to do. It depends on who's providing it. There are some less expensive. I mean, the worst case of this is kind of is Mechanical Turk. I don't think anyone really uses Mechanical Turk so much for surveys anymore. They do use them for experiments, which is a different kind of set of conditions, but it's hard to get good representative data from Mechanical Turk. If you are not aware, Mechanical Turk was and still is, I guess, a service offered by Google where it's kind of like a micro gig service where you can pay someone 25 cents to do something small for you. Often it was designed to be used for training large scale learning models, right? You needed humans to produce training data, but it's been used for all sorts of things. and researchers have used it for experiments for if you need someone to code something that you don't think a computer can do, they can do some of those kinds of things. If you want to experiment on people, you can do some kind of micro experimenting this way. So I guess that's the worst possible way of coming up with a panel. I think actually there are survey panels on Mechanical Turk, or there were at some point. I don't know that I would trust those particularly. I've mentioned a couple that are pretty commonly used in the social sciences. As you get to more specific panels, this can get more and more expensive. But that's not really a methodological concern. The methodological concerns are that these are people that have been over-surveyed. They're experienced survey takers. That can be good or bad, but it is not representative of the public. You can have kind of this repeated, especially if they've hit your measures before. If you're using a validated set of measures, you can have a conditioning effect where they have been conditioned by this. There's a certain reduced level of naivete about questions. They are probably pretty expert at what surveys look like. They probably recognize when you have spoilers in there, or when you have things that are meant to validate your measures. They probably are able to get through things more quickly without it being just a speed run. They just are used to answering some of these questions, so they might run through it quickly. So you've got those pieces, right? If you have a survey design that has branches, they may be doing their own satisficing by knowing that if they answer in a certain way, they can avoid a whole section of your survey. So they might be strategic about that. So there's all kinds of things that this kind of introduces when you have experienced survey takers. I think most of those are honestly, from my perspective, some of those concerns around bias are offset by the fact that you actually can get together someone to answer your survey. So that I don't think those are necessarily for the right kinds of questions, especially when you're looking for a general audience set of questions, or within a population at a national level, or even at a state level. You can limit these in some ways. You can tell the panel, I want people that have, for example, a 4-year degree. There are kinds of ways of bracketing these panels, but I think it can be a really useful thing, and the bias is worth it as long as you're aware of it and you're thinking about it as you're doing your design. So you need to make sure you're reporting where your sample came from, no matter what, but particularly when it's a panel sample, you need to talk a little bit about this, and you need to make sure that your conclusions, when you write this up, that you're being explicit about some of these potential biases. And this is the broken record part of this. You need to pilot your survey. You need to pilot your survey by showing it to people who have not seen the survey before. So you can't just use the same person or people to look at your survey. They need to see it not having been you, not being in your field in many cases. They need to in some way reflect the population you're trying to study. And you have to figure out whether the questions are actually clear to people that have not been in your headspace. You have to make sure that the survey is not so long that they won't complete it. If you can't get someone in a pilot to complete your survey, there's no way you're going to get it to a full run out of the survey. Your friends might do it. Again, good reason not to use your friends in this case. How tired are people getting? Are they just kind of at the end of a survey? If you have some kind of fatigue among the respondent, you're just going to get people trying to get through it. You can see this in the amount of time they spend on it, in the straight lining, and some of the other ways they might not be attending to your survey by the end of it. And you can make sure that people might be able to access it across devices. This is somewhat of a UX problem as well. So you need to pilot this, and then use that pilot information to engage in revision. Like UX, it's sometimes helpful if it's something that's on a device. If it's something that you're going to be having people do over the web or on their phones, it can be useful to sit next to them while they're doing, actually be there and be aware of how they're having trouble with the interface too, not just the questions. So it can be useful to kind of think about whether you can be in the space as well while they're doing this. So pilot, and then pilot again, and make sure that you're doing this with not just one or two people, but a small subset of people, to make sure that your instrument actually works. Again, if you're doing a survey of 300 or 500 or 1,200 people, this seems like it's, especially if you're on a time crunch, this seems like it's a horrible grind to kind of go through this iterative process of testing. But it is far better, especially if you're paying respondents, or if you have something like that, or if you get a survey back and one of the items just doesn't work. It is way nicer to find that out before you put it out to a few hundred people by testing it with a few dozen. And honestly, I've done a survey where we had an item that was badly worded, and basically we had a bunch of people say, I don't know what you mean. Like, we had hundreds of people saying, I don't get I'm not sure what you mean by this, and that's a problem for that item. Basically, we had to throw it out because it was a bad item. But it also screws up the rest of your instrument, right? Because if they've run into something where they don't know what the hell you're talking about, that really messes them up for the things that follows, because they're like, okay, why did they ask that stupid question? Are all the rest of the questions going to be this stupid? I don't know that we actually saw whether people abandoned the survey at that point, but it's really possible that someone will hit a question like that, and if it's bad enough, they'll just say, if they can't be bothered to write the question well, why am I going to be bothered to answer any of the rest of these, right? things like typos, even like, if you have a typo in your survey, people will judge you on your typos. This is not, there's a certain level of I will judge you on your typos. Like if I'm filling out a survey and someone has simply missed some punctuation in some way, I'm like, that bothers me, because it's like, if I noticed this, why didn't the researcher notice it? So even simple things like that, putting this in front of a small group will have people, especially a small group of critical people, will help you kind of make for a better survey instrument. So just to sum this up, this is already too long. Don't just ask questions. This is the same as the interview thing, right? You need to be going into this with the idea of, what am I getting out of this and how can I use it? So you kind of have to back into it. At some point, you're going to have to analyze this data. Can you, knowing what kind of data, not the actual answers you'll get, but the shape of the data that you want to see on the back end, the kinds of measures, the kinds of relationships you're looking for, you then back into the instrument. So the instrument should be servicing that end goal of having a set of tools a set of answers you could analyze with the tools you're going to use. That kind of careful process of design, of reflexivity, of thinking about what you're putting into this, of transparency, these are essential. They don't guarantee that you have good results, but they're an essential part of that process. A good survey does more than just generate data. It supports your interpretation, it enables meaningful inference, and it contributes more broadly to social knowledge.